Hello, this is episode number 9 of the Martial Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Jacobs. I'm a martial artist, martial arts journalist, former contributing editor to Black Belt Magazine, and I tell stories about martial arts. So we've been off for a few weeks, had some difficulties trying to schedule and then record an interview with a guest for this episode. Hopefully we can reschedule him, but I didn't want to go any longer without releasing this new podcast. The main item I wanted to discuss here relates to an article I just posted on my website. There's a link to it down in the show notes for anyone interested in reading it, but I'm going to give some background here on how this article and consequently this episode of the podcast came about. Around 5 or 6 years ago, I was watching, I think it was ESPN, and they had a segment about a gay football player. If I recall correctly, I think he was trying to become the first openly gay player to make it onto an NFL team. As I was watching this, it occurred to me I couldn't think of a single famous male martial artist who was openly gay. There are a number of well-known gay women martial artists, several famous UFC fighters like Amanda Nunes, but I couldn't think of a single famous male martial artist who was gay, not in MMA or any martial art, which I found interesting. And as I thought about this, it occurred to me I couldn't think of any martial artists at all whom I knew personally who I knew to be gay. And that's not something I ever really cared about. Who somebody else chooses to sleep with has never been of any concern to me. So I just never really took note of anything like that. I mean, I'm not gay, so maybe I don't have a good, what they call, gaydar to pick up on who is gay. But you get to know people over the years in martial arts, and they might mention their girlfriend or you meet their wife or whatever. But I couldn't think of anyone who I knew to be gay within the martial arts community. And they have to be out there. The law of averages say a certain number of people across the population are gay, so it's probably that way in martial arts. And I got to thinking, do gay people feel the martial arts community is so narrow-minded that gay martial artists really try to not let anyone know their sexual orientation because they fear being ostracized or something like that? I suppose that might be especially true for famous martial artists. There's certainly an element of machismo at play in the martial arts, and I could see where a gay person might imagine that would harm their credibility within the industry. Whether that's true or not, I could see them worrying about it. Anyway, I emailed my editor at Black Belt Magazine at the time, Bob Young, and said, "Hey Bob, I saw this thing on TV about a gay football player, and it made me realize I couldn't think of a single famous gay male martial artist. Can you?" And he emailed me back and said none came to mind for him either. So I think I then kind of floated the idea of doing a feature story on this for Black Belt, but never got any response. A little while after this, I got asked by them to do a story on black people in the martial arts and the discrimination they had to overcome, which probably came about 30 years too late as a feature subject. I think it might have been a more relevant story 30 years ago, but a job is a job, and I wrote a two-part article, which I was pretty proud of. I think it was one of the better pieces I ever wrote for them, and it got some good feedback. A lot of people seemed to like it. Then, about 2.5 years ago, Bob emailed me and said the story on black martial artists had been pretty well received, and he had an idea to do something in a similar vein on gay martial artists. Would I be interested in writing that? And I said, "That's a great idea you have there, Bob. I wish I had thought of that." But he was always pretty busy and honestly probably didn't recall my mentioning this a few years earlier. But the idea was still valid, so I said, sure, let me do some research and see if I can find some gay martial artists to talk to for it. I think originally the idea was to do something on the whole LGBTQ community in martial arts, but as I got into this and started to find a number of people who were pretty experienced martial artists and who were openly gay, I realized we had to take a more narrow approach because if we got into discussing the trans community, that would lead to a whole different set of issues to address, and the story would have ended up being around 10,000 words instead of the little over 2,000 they gave me for a feature story. So I decided to narrow it primarily to the topic of gay men participating in martial arts, how many of them there might be, and why they may not be more visible. And in the process of this, I found an organization devoted to gay martial artists. I found a number of gay BJJ players. I found someone who was at the time the only openly gay men's professional MMA fighter. Bottom line is, I did a load of research and talked to a lot of people for this. And I'll be honest, I went into the story thinking that martial artists were generally kind of conservative and maybe not that welcoming to gay people. And I was expecting a lot of horror stories from the people I interviewed about how they were discriminated against in various dojos, and that was what I figured the theme of the story would be. But much to my dismay, I found that wasn't the case. That very few people I talked to had any stories about being discriminated against within the martial arts world. Now, that's great for gay people, but terrible for a reporter. I mean, I'm a journalist. Journalists love reporting bad news. We don't want to say everything is fine and dandy because that doesn't generate much controversy or make for an exciting story. But I also believe you follow a story wherever it goes and report on it honestly. And honestly, what I was getting from almost everyone I talked to was that martial arts weren't that bad when it came to discrimination, that they hadn't faced much prejudice, even when they were open about being gay. And believe me, I really tried to find more evidence that this wasn't the case. I tried contacting gay rights groups to ask if they knew of people within martial arts who were being discriminated against, but I just didn't find anything. Now, things may have changed over the last couple of years. I know there have been a couple of knucklehead UFC fighters who have made some very homophobic remarks, and I've seen a couple of other little things in the news, so I don't know exactly what the current climate is. Also, I do say in the story that my reporting could have been a little self selecting in that I was talking to people who were actively involved in martial arts, so obviously those are people who have had primarily positive experiences with martial arts. There might be a lot of gay people who had negative experiences when they went to train in martial arts and just quit, but I don't know how you'd go about finding people like that. There's no Facebook user group that I know of for disgruntled former martial artists who hate martial arts. So I had to just go with the sources I could find, which were pretty extensive. I talked to at least 15 different people for this, which is much more than you'd normally do for a black belt feature. But like I said, I take journalism seriously, so I try to be as thorough as possible. Anyway, I wrote up what I thought was a pretty decent story and submitted it to Bob Young, maybe a little over 2 years ago now. And I waited a couple of months, which was not unusual for them to take that long to get to editing a story. But then another couple of months went by, and I still hadn't heard anything, which bothered me because I didn't get paid until the story actually ran in the magazine. And a couple of the people I interviewed contacted me and asked when the story was coming out, so I finally contacted Bob and asked if they were still planning on running it, and he assured me they were, that they just had to find the right spot for it. Then a couple of more months went by and I still hadn't heard anything, so I contacted him again and again got assurances they still planned to use the story. And this continued every few months for about a full year until I finally emailed Bob and said, "What's the holdup here? You've had the story for a year. Are you going to use it or not?" And he emailed me back that he was having trouble getting approval to run the story. I didn't ask approval from who, but I assume it was the ownership. Now, besides the print version of the magazine, I was doing a lot of work for Black Belt's website at the time and had a very good relationship with Patrick, the website editor, and I knew Patrick seemed to be pretty tight with the ownership there, so I said to Bob, "Do you mind if I offer the story to Patrick to see if he wants to run it on the website?" And he said to go ahead, and I did. And Patrick said he liked the story, but then he never posted it on the website. And when I asked him what's with the holdup, he said he was having trouble getting it approved. And I don't know what the problem was in getting the story approved. I don't want to give the impression that anyone in the ownership was homophobic because I have no direct evidence of that. My few dealings with one of the owners were very positive, and he always seemed like a good guy. But the bottom line is, it seems they never wanted to run this story, which is pretty ironic because it was a story that said there doesn't seem to be a lot of discrimination against gay people in martial arts. And it was overall a fairly positive piece on the martial arts industry, which, if you have a martial arts magazine, usually that's the kind of stuff you want to print. I will say that early on in the story, I was talking with people who were part of Chuck Norris's martial arts organization, and I was made aware of some perceived anti gay comments that have been attributed to Norris over the years. And that's kind of important to a story like this that a martial artist as famous as Chuck Norris had allegedly made some homophobic remarks. So I was making efforts to contact Norris to get his side of this and asked Bob Young if he could get me in touch with Norris. And he said he didn't have the contacts with Chuck, but then he kind of warned me that one of the owners was very close friends with Norris, and I should tread lightly on anything negative surrounding Chuck. And that's not what I like to hear as a journalist. To me, the truth is the truth, and you have a duty to report on something like that. But honestly, I probably did temper down what I had to say about Norris in the article, maybe more than I should have after Bob said this to me. And I didn't feel like I was that overly critical of him in the story. So I don't know if that's why they couldn't get approval to run the piece, or if someone felt that it would just be too controversial, or if there was some other issue someone had. But they decided not to run it. They did ultimately pay me a kill fee, which the standard for that is half of what you would get if the story actually ran, which was way too little for the amount of work I put in on a story like that. But that's the way it goes in the writing business. And shortly after this, Black Belt was sold, and I talked with the new editors and owners about my being part of the new regime there, and I mentioned the story about gay martial artists that I had, and they said sure, send it to us, which I did, and I never got any reply at all from them. Again, I don't know if they felt the topic was too controversial or because they were in the process of basically killing off the magazine that they just didn't want to be bothered. But the bottom line is the story has lingered now for more than 2 years. I've tried contacting a couple of other outlets, one a general sports website, one a gay sports website, and asked if they'd be interested in looking at the story, but got no response from either website, which is not unusual in the writing business these days. Most editors are, to put it politely, less than responsive to writers. So the story never found a home, which is why I'm now posting it on my own website. Again, for anyone who is interested in this and wants to take a look at it, read it, judge it for themselves, there's a link to my site, writingfighting.wordpress.com, down in the show notes where you can find the article. And just to be clear, I had no agenda in writing this. I generally tend to steer clear of most political topics, and the article I wrote is not advocating for or against anything other than maybe everyone should be treated with respect in the dojo, which I don't think should be a controversial topic within martial arts. If anything, I merely found this an interesting subject that I've never seen written about in any martial arts publication before, and I thought it was worth discussing and exploring. One other quick note here. This past week saw the passing of 56-year-old actor Taylor Wily, who appeared in the movie Forgetting Sarah Marshall and had a recurring role in the Hawaii Five-O TV show reboot, but who may be better known to MMA fans as Taylor Wily, a moderately successful sumo wrestler who competed in the very first broadcast fight ever at the very first UFC, where he got knocked out by Gerard Gordeau. For anybody whose memory goes back that far, they'll recall just how incredibly brutal a beating Thule received there, and how it seemed to shock not just a lot of the fans, but even the commentators. Remember, almost no one had seen anything like what we now call MMA prior to UFC 1 outside of people who had witnessed particularly brutal street fights. This was back before the unified rules of MMA even came into existence, so almost anything was legal back then, including kicking a downed opponent in the head, which is what happened in this fight. Thule slipped down along the fence right at the beginning, and Gordeau hauled off and kicked him flush in the face with a roundhouse kick, then cracked him with a hook for good measure. He supposedly sent one of Thule's teeth flying toward the announcer's desk. Another tooth ended up embedded in Gordeau's foot. I recall Art Jimerson, who was a professional boxer who also appeared on that first UFC show and who also died recently. He told me that his manager was out there watching that first fight between Thule and Gordeau, and he came back into the dressing room where Jimerson was preparing for his fight, and the manager had tears in his eyes and started pleading with Jimerson not to go out there and fight in this thing. There was actually a lot of controversy surrounding the stoppage of the fight at the time. The referee, who I think was Joao Alberto Barreto, a high-ranking Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner, stepped in and waved off the fight, which Thule and his corner initially protested because the rules stated that fights could only be won by knockout or submission. There was nothing said about referees stepping in on their own to stop a fight while a fighter was still conscious, although that's obviously a prescription for getting fighters killed, and Barreto clearly made the right call. Anyway, I had the opportunity to interview Taylor Wily a few years ago. He was initially a little reluctant to talk, I think because of how he had been portrayed over the years for losing that fight so quickly and brutally. But once he opened up, from what I could tell, I found him to be a very engaging and well-grounded human being. He actually was grateful toward the referee for stopping the fight and told me he wanted to thank him for showing compassion in what was a very violent and chaotic situation, which I thought was a really interesting and thoughtful statement on his part. Taylor more or less admitted that the kind of no rules fighting they were doing at UFC 1 wasn't really for him, not just because of his skill set, but for the fact he just wasn't comfortable looking to really badly hurt people, which is to your detriment as a fighter, but maybe to your credit as a human being. He did also mention that besides having been in the very first televised UFC fight, he claimed he was the first person to actually sign the final contract to fight at UFC 1. He said the night before the fight, they had a fighter meeting and no one was quite sure what to make of this whole thing. Some of them still thought it might be worked matches, like a pro wrestling exhibition, rather than real no-holds-barred fights. And there were apparently some arguments back and forth about the rules and what actually would or wouldn't be allowed, and according to him, no one was willing to sign the final contract to fight, so he told me he finally just wrote his name down on the contract and stood up and said, "I'm here to party. If any of you want to party, I'll see you at the arena tomorrow." Then walked out, and everyone else soon fell in line and signed their contracts too, and the rest is history. I don't know if that's true or not. but it's a great story, and Thule had a few of those. And it's unfortunate to see him pass at such a young age, both because he did seem to be a genuinely decent human being, and also because he was a living link to mixed martial arts origins. With the passing of Jimerson and now Willie, fully half of the fighters who appeared in the tournament at UFC 1 a little over 30 years ago are now deceased. But as long as people watch the UFC, guys like Art Jimerson and Taylor Wily, who had the courage to go out there into the unknown and fight it out, win or lose, will be remembered. That's all we've got for today's show. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Eleanor Academia for providing the music to the show. Again, you can find the link to the article I wrote on gay martial artists on my website. The link is down in the show notes. And we'll hopefully be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. Until then, keep punching.